Thanks for that, Cheryl. Well, good morning. Good to be up here to open the Word with you and to hear what God has for us today. When I was considering this message for our theme, going along with this theme this semester, this year, Matters of the Heart, my mind went back to the words of one of my mentors, now more than 40 years ago, in my early years of ministry. He was a gifted teacher, gifted pastor, and he gave me these words of advice from his own years of ministry. He said to me, "When you preach to broken hearts, because there is more than one sitting in every pew." The fact that he said pew dates it in itself, doesn't it? But I have never forgotten that piece of advice over these 4 decades of my ministry. And I have found his words to be wise, and I have found them to be true. It is certainly good counsel for those of us, those of you who are preparing for ministry in the church or as missionaries. But I have found those words to be just as relevant, just as true, for those who are preparing for a ministry of teaching in a school or a ministry of counseling. Certainly counselors see plenty of broken hearts. Indeed, all of us who care for people need to be attentive to the hearts of others as we care for them, as we teach them, as we minister to them, as we counsel them, as we walk with people through life. I had such a good reminder of that one day when I was teaching at Biola University. A student came in late in the middle of class and walked in. He looked around and he found an empty seat and sat down. It was a fairly full class. And as he sat down, these words came to me. I believe they were from the Lord. He said, "Be gentle. You don't know where he has just come from." So after class, I made it a point to go to this student and to have a chat with him, because it was unusual for this student to be late. We pay attention to unusual behaviors, don't we? And I said to him, "I noticed you were a bit late for class today. I hope everything's okay." He looked at me and he said, "I'm sorry, I just got a text. My father just died. And I didn't know what else to do." He said, "I just knew that I wanted to be someplace safe and familiar." Safe and familiar. So he came to class. I wonder if that begins to help us understand a picture that we read in John chapter 21. I wonder if this begins to describe what's going on in the hearts of the disciples here in this story that you may have read many, many times. John chapter 21 begins this way. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he revealed himself in this way: Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." And they said to him, "We'll go with you." And they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. It begins with some interesting words, after this. The truth is, there's a lot of this captured in that word, isn't there? There's a lot of this that takes place before this scene. We go back over those few chapters just previous to this, and we see some of the most unsettling, confusing, disorienting experiences of these disciples' lives. The man that they had given themselves to was suddenly taken away from them, arrested, killed, buried, and resurrected. They'd had a couple of encounters with Jesus, and he told them to go ahead to Galilee. And it's easy to think that once he's been resurrected, everything's great, right? Everything should suddenly make sense, but I wonder if they're now even more confused than ever. What in the world is going on? They are living in this in-between space between resurrection and what next? They didn't know. Matthew includes the instructions, tell my brothers to go to Galilee and I will see them soon. And so they go and they wait. And as they are waiting, Peter gets a bit anxious. He says, verse 3, I'm going fishing. I am going fishing, and the rest say, yes, we'll go with you. You know what that's like, don't you? I do. When life is confusing, when life is hard, we want to retreat to some place safe and familiar. I remember when we were living in China, we hit one of those acculturation moments. Those of you who have lived cross-culturally for some time will understand what this is like. It was the second Christmas we lived in China. We had been there for a couple of years by this time, and the honeymoon was definitely over. We were beyond the honeymoon. We were in that place that we refer to in cultural adaptation, culture fatigue. It's that point when you are tired of the culture. You're beyond culture shock and beyond all those kinds of things. Now you're just tired of it. But you realize, oh, this is going to be my life for a very long time. Reality really, really sets in. So I thought, well, what could we do to get through this season of life, of learning to settle in, and what can we do to just kind of help ourselves through this culture fatigue phase? And so I was online looking at airline tickets. I thought, well, maybe we could just fly home for Christmas, spend a couple weeks in the States with friends and family, and just get a little bit of a break, and then we can come back, settle back in, and life will be good, right? So I was sitting there at my desk looking at these things, and my wife comes walking in the room, and she looks over my shoulder, and she looked at the computer screen, and she said, yeah, make mine a one-way ticket. I am not coming back to this place. Well, my son then walked in the middle of this conversation. He looked and said, what are you looking at, Dad? And Mom said, airline tickets. And he said, yeah, make mine a one-way ticket too. I am never coming back. I am done with this place. Well, I closed my computer screen and I thought, we need a better solution to this problem. 2 one-way tickets and 1 round. No, that was not an option. That was not an option. We worked through it. We ended up loving living in China. That is the end of the story. My son loves it so much, he moved back to Asia and says, I'm never living in America again. So there you go. But I imagine this is the feeling that these men have been wrestling with as they sit around their old home. It probably seemed like they could just go back to their old life again. It all seems so normal. It seems so natural. After all, these are fishermen, right? So they get back in their boats. They throw their nets into the water. And I think it's a good place for each of us to just simply pause and reflect. What is my fishing boat? What is that place? When life is confusing, when the work is too hard, when it's just too overwhelming, when I look at my circumstances or the difficult people or whatever frustration is in my life, where am I tempted to run back to? We think about men who had lost their sense of belonging. They had lost their sense of direction. They were filled with confusion. They're filled with fear. I wonder if this is what it looks like. Go back to something safe and familiar. Back to where they had been at the very point where Jesus originally meant them. And that's the turning point of the story. The account reads a lot like a case of déjà vu, doesn't it? You've had that feeling. Haven't I been here before? When we compare this passage with Luke chapter 5, we get the same sense. So much of it is exactly the same. It's the scene where Jesus calls Peter to be one of his disciples. And here is Peter in this confusing low point of his life, once again being met by Jesus. It's one of the beautiful things about this story. It's Jesus who makes the first move to reconnect with the disciples. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but that's a pattern all through Scripture. Starting in the first chapters of Genesis, God makes the first move toward us so often. So he makes this first move toward the disciples. He calls out, "Children, do you have any fish?" I love that term, children. It could be translated friends. It's an affectionate term. And that's a very significant thing in this story, especially in this particular experience that they're having. He doesn't wait for them. He doesn't wait for us. He makes the first move, but he makes that first move not as a judge, not with words of guilt, not with words of condemnation. He comes as a loving friend. Be gentle. I've often found in my times of deepest confusion and disconnection that God often takes me back to that place where he originally called me to be his child, or where he called me into the work that I'm doing. Interesting, the work that I'm doing. Tim, I just came across something this morning. 10 years ago tomorrow, you and I had our first conversation. Talk about going back to the place where God called you. Yeah, those are happy memories, aren't they? Yeah. Back to the place. Those moments are important, I think. I remember things like that, those milestone moments. But he takes us back to that place where he calls us. He reminds us of those moments where we took our first baby steps of faith and dropped the nets and followed him. Sometimes in our journey of reconnecting with God, reconnecting with ourselves, and that mending of a broken heart, we need to go back to that moment when we first experienced his call, his healing touch, that word that sets us on our course. Where is that for you? I encourage you to return to those places on occasion. I remember when my wife and I did leave China several years after the experience that Christmas. We followed what seemed like God's very clear path to us, but a few years later, things seemed so dark, so bleak, so obscure. More than once, I said to my wife, maybe we heard wrong. Maybe we made all this up. And in prayer one day, the Lord so clearly spoke to Sue, and he said to her, don't give up on the calling that I have placed on your life. And in prayer, he took both of us back to the place where he spoke so clearly and so obviously, and I could point that out to you in the very day, the very spot where that happened. Such circumstances teach us not to question in the dark what God has made known in the light. It's good for us to go back, to be reminded to sit in the places of our first calling, to reconnect with God, reconnect with yourself, a place of remembrance, a place of healing. And that takes us to the second scene in this account, where it focuses on just Jesus and Peter. That begins to happen in verse 9. When they got out on land, they see a charcoal fire in place. You know, there is only one other mention in Scripture of a charcoal fire. Just a few chapters earlier, John 18:18. Just a few weeks before this scene. The night Jesus was arrested, there was Peter sitting by a charcoal fire. He not only denied Jesus, but Matthew tells us that he denied him with swearing and invoking a curse. When we picture that scene, we see that Peter isn't far off in some other place, and he is probably within sight and within hearing distance of Jesus. It is very possible that Jesus was a witness to the event. He was certainly not far away. Philip Keller describes it like this. Precisely at this point, the great doors to the high priest's residence swung open. Jesus, still bound with ropes and chains, was led across the courtyard. His handsome face was crimson, flushed from the captain's cruel blows, but his eyes were bright and clear. Crossing the open patio, he turned and looked squarely at Simon Peter. There was love and longing and deep understanding in that glance. And then he was gone, led away into the great hall of Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin was assembled. It was a passing, fleeting incident, but it pulverized Peter's pride. The big, powerful man got up and strode away into the dim gray light of dawn. And outside and away from prying eyes, a torrent of tears fell from his eyes. He was a man broken in spirit, contrite in heart. He had 3 times betrayed his master. It was the low point of his life. He could sink no further in utter despair. His conduct was an absolute disaster. Peter had crossed a line that he said he would never cross. And there he sits by this fire with Jesus, who serves him breakfast. The sight of the fire, no doubt, brings back the memory. We don't like to revisit those places of failure, do we? It's too painful. But who better to sit in that place with than Jesus? He meets all of the disciples, but especially Peter, in this place with enormous grace, limitless love, as he had so many times before, and he fed them. He broke the bread and he fed them physically, but I think more importantly, he fed them spiritually. So here is Peter and Jesus. Of all these men, he is feeling the weight of failure far more greatly. It is often in this place of the pain of our failure, where the brokenness of our heart is most acute, and that is where God does his deepest work. And he does it with care. He does it with gentleness. So here they sit, a reminder of failure, but in the safe presence of his dearest friend. So after they finish breakfast, Peter and Jesus get up and they go for a walk on the beach. There's a feeling of intimacy, there's a feeling of safety in their conversation. The memory of 3 denials still lurks in Peter's mind. Jesus breaks the silence with a question. Simon, do you love me more than these? We don't know what the more than these is. And to be honest, I'm kind of glad about that. Because it enables me to personalize the question. It enables you to personalize the question for yourself, doesn't it? I know what the more than these might be for me. But finish the question for yourself. Do you love me more than... Fill in the blank with something from your own life. 3 times, verses 15 through 17, Jesus asks the question, once for each denial. It's as though Jesus is gently walking him back through the scene, healing and redeeming Peter's story. 3 denials and 3 questions. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter is broken. He says, you know all things. Yes, I love you. And so Jesus responds, then feed my sheep. Here in the shadow of his greatest failure, Jesus entrusts the care of his church to Peter. He is reminded, and so are we, that there is healing and there is life and there is restoration to ministry beyond the failure. Every once in a while, I have a conversation with a person who lives with a deep concern that they have committed the unforgivable sin. I've heard plenty of those thoughts over the years. But I've also had a lot of conversations with somebody in ministry who has said, I've done something that disqualifies me from ministry. I wonder if those thoughts were on Peter's mind as he is sitting here with Jesus. And Jesus would have known that, I think. But I'm reminded, too, that there is no safer place to take a broken heart. or a confused heart, or a questioning heart, than to sit there with Jesus. And he sits with us in that place, and he takes us back through that process of healing, and he redeems our stories for good. I don't know where this story touches you, but I do know that every single one of us has lived with failure at some point in life. We have all had the unfortunate experience of having a heart that has been broken, a heart that's been confused, a heart that's been betrayed by another. And maybe taking a walk with Jesus on the beach is just what you need to heal that broken heart, to redeem your story. I think it's also a good reminder for all of us who care for other people, and that's virtually everyone in this room. Be gentle. You don't know what that person has just come from. Be one of those people who cares for wounded hearts. And God may use you in that process of healing. Cheryl.